Hey Internet, it's your old friend Dominic here with the All-American Casino Guide, a channel dedicated to providing you with all the tips, tricks, tutorials, and sometimes trivia you could possibly need to know about casinos and casino games. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and make sure to ring-a-ding-ding that notification bell because it's the only way that you're guaranteed to be notified every single time we upload one of these fantastic videos to our channel. Today, we're going to be talking about Texas Hold'em and how to recognize and evaluate the strength of your starting hand. Now, Texas Hold'em is a very popular game. In fact, I would say it's the most popular poker variant out there right now. And one of the keys to mastering this variant of poker is understanding the value of your starting hand and whether you're actually holding a good hand, a mid-level hand, or a bad hand. So the first thing I want to talk about before I get into talking about good hands is rookie mistakes. The first of which that I see so many players making at the poker table is playing too many hands. I understand it gets boring just sitting there watching other people earning money and you're just sitting back watching it all happen. But it's very important that you only play the good hands. A common rookie mistake is that they play too many hands because they hope to get something in the flop, which of course is the first 3 cards that are revealed in the community pool. It's common to feel that excitement whenever you actually match up anything and you feel this sense of euphoria as those community cards match up with what you have and you realize that you actually have something where before you might have had nothing. Now, there is some truth to the fact that you never really know the strength of your hand until all 5 community cards are on the table. But depending on your style of play, it's essentially gambling. And you're not really using skill. A skilled player doesn't play every single hand, but is in fact actually very selective and only plays good hands. An issue that needs to influence your decision to play a hand or not is if you happen to be blind committed or not. If you're not blind committed, it's really easy to drop out of a hand because you have no money invested in that particular hand. But if you are blind committed, it gets a little bit more difficult to judge if you should stay in a hand or not. But I will say this much, that if you are the big blind and there has not been any real monstrous re-raises on the hand, then maybe it's a good idea to stay in because you're already semi-chip committed. Problems arise when you get into the habit of calling blinds, even when you have a poor hand, just in order to see that flop. There is some truth in saying that you really don't know your outs in a particular hand until you see that flop. But you're just gonna end up hurting yourself in the long run. You're gonna be bleeding yourself to death, especially if you happen to be playing in a tournament where you have a fixed number of chips and blinds continue to go up and up and up as time goes on. Reserve your chips for the long run. Only go in on a big blind bet if you happened to think that there is a distinct possibility that the flop is going to improve your hand. With that said, it's best to play poker as a skill game and not rely too much on the idea of chance or luck. Let's move on to what is generally considered to be a good hand, and then later we can start talking about what are the bad hands in Texas Hold'em. There are many factors to consider when it comes to evaluating the strength of your hands. The first is the intrinsic value of individual cards themselves. The second is the potential value and combination of those 2 cards. And the third is the likelihood of them forming a strong hand with those community cards. Then, of course, there's the potential of them being better than the cards or hands of other players. Because at the end of the day, second place pays nothing. A pocket pair is generally considered one of the best hands you could be holding in a game of Texas Hold'em. And of course, the best hand one could be holding in a game of Texas Hold'em would be a pair of aces or bullets. But let me burst your bubble for a second here. Even if you were one of those lucky few people to be dealt aces, you only have an 85% chance that that hand will hold out in the long run. There are a number of different card combinations that could break this hand. Even though, statistically speaking, it's a very strong hand, it's not one of those unbeatable hands that people think it is, all right? And even other high hands, such as a pair of kings or cowboys, only has an 83% chance. A pair of queens or ladies sitting at about 80% chance. And finally, jacks or fish hooks sit at about 78% chance. So in my opinion, anything less than a pair of tens is really gambling. That is not a strong pocket pair. And in fact, the worst pocket pair you could have is the pair of deuces. And let me tell you right now, the chances that a pair of deuces is going to hold out all the way to the showdown as the strongest hand is sitting at about 51%, which is not much better than just going to a roulette table and betting on red. So if you get in the habit of playing pairs of twos, you're really playing the wrong game. Another important thing to consider though is when I tell you these percentages is that the less players you have at the table, the better your chances are that those particular hands are going to hold out in the long run. So something to be considerate of is if you're playing heads up or four-handed or even nine-handed at some tournaments, you need to be aware of how many players are still in the hand. Just beneath pocket pairs are high suited connectors. People generally consider these good hands, and there's a reason for that. So when, for example, if you have like ace, king suited, all right, in this example, spades, or queen, jack suited, we have hearts, and of course, jack 10 clubs, we generally consider these good hands. And the reason for that is because you have the possibility of getting a flush, the possibility of getting a straight, or even the possibility of matching one of these cards and having a high pair. So for example, if you have the ace and king of spades, then you have a very good chance of getting another ace or another king and having at least a pair of kings or a pair of aces. And then, you know, in a perfect world, of course, you would have two aces and a king come up on the flop, and then you'd have a full house, you know. But having these suited connectors puts you in a great position to actually build a hand. And of course, if you have this ace-king situation like this, you're well on your way to that infamous royal flush. Within that same thread of thought, though, comes the idea of high offsuit connectors. This is situations like where you have jack 10 or king, queen, or even ace, king, but they just happen to be offsuit with each other, the three examples I provided here. Now, you still have the distinct possibility of forming a straight or even matching one of these cards and having a nice high pair. But when you are offsuit, you kind of lose that possibility of having a flush. And a flush is really considered a good hand. Anything less than a flush is really kind of mid-level hands here. It's important for me to mention though, that anything less than a 10 as far as connectors is really not very good. Even 10-9, you're still putting yourself in a position where that 9 could easily be beaten by a face card or an ace. So that pretty much sums up those classical good starting hands. But there are a number of good mid-level hands that I care to talk about right now. So for example, like a pair of eights, okay? Earlier I said anything less than a pair of tens as far as pocket pair go is a bit of gambling. But a pair of eights is still a pretty good hand, all right? Pair of sixes, very middle of the road. There's certainly a number of hands that are better, and there's certainly a number of hands that are worse. And even hands like 7-6, okay? You have off-suited connectors, or even if you do go on suit, okay? So you, for example, if you had 6-7 suited, you have two clubs here, for example. These hands can turn into something very good, especially if you happen to be playing in a small table. If you happen to be four-handed or three-handed or heads up, a pair of sixes is a great hand. But if you're playing 7, 8, or 9 players at a table, a pair of sixes, I don't want to burst your bubble, is probably not going to hold up unless over the course of getting the community cards out, that pair of sixes turned into 4 of a kind, trips or full house, or for example. Remember, a flush is a very good hand, and remember, a straight is always beaten by a flush. So if you have two suited cards like this, that is a very good hand to have for the potential of drawing a flush. But remember that you only have 2 cards out of 5 when it comes to that flush. So in order for you to get a flush in this particular situation, you would have to see 3 other clubs on the table, all right? That's 5 cards total, but your high card is a 7. So anyone holding an 8, 9, 10, jack, queen, king, or ace, that particular suit, is going to beat you in the long run. Other hands that are still considered mid-level but have some real potential of forming into good hands are things like ace, queen on suit, all right? So these are not connected, but they still have the possibility of forming that straight or that flush depending on which other cards come in the community pool, okay? You have things like King Jack, okay? So these are offsuit, but they are still high-ranking cards. So you easily could see a King or a Jack come up in the community pool, giving you a relatively high pair of cards. Also, you could see the Queen, the 10, and the 9 come up, or the Ace, Queen, 10 come up in the community and form yourself up a nice straight here. Other hands that are not connectors, 9-7, that's a fairly decent hand because you have the possibility of going into a straight in any sort of direction. You even have cards like 8-5, okay? So you could end up seeing the 6, 7, and 9, or 4, 6, and 7. These are all cards that you have to think about constantly what kind of hand you could potentially build with the community cards and the cards you have in your hold. Also, another thing to be considerate of is what the possible hands that your opponents could have. So this is kind of a thinking game where you have to constantly be aware of what's out there, and moreover, what could potentially show up if one card comes in the next round of betting. Let's talk about those bad starting hands that are just terrible and you shouldn't ever play them because the chances of them ever paying out is astronomically low. So we already talked about a pair of 2s earlier being nothing more than a 51% chance of holding out in the long run. But then there are other horrible hands like, for example, 3-9, okay? Where this is offsuit, all right, diamond and heart, and they're not connectors or even in a range of connectors. They're completely out of position. And you have a really low card, and even your high card is not really that high, being a 9, all right? And then, of course, the worst hand you could possibly be ever holding, a 2-7. It's exactly like the situation I had here, but even worse, all right? You have no chance of a flush. You have no chance of a straight without a lot of help. And if you do get the help you need, chances are your opponent gets the same amount of help and is probably in a better position overall. It's not impossible to get a flush in this particular situation. Just realize that if you do get a flush, your high card is a 7. Or it is possible to turn this 9 into a pair of 9s, but it's a pair of 9s. Even if you pair up both of them, you have a pair of 9s and a pair of 3s, okay? 2 pair. That seems like a fairly decent hand. But reality is, even if someone has a pair of 10s and a pair of 2s, they've beaten you. So in reality, these kinds of hands are not good. So always keep in mind what we've talked about earlier, keeping those high-ranked cards, 10s, jacks, queens, kings, aces, and suited cards and high connectors. Those are what you're aiming for. So in reality, you shouldn't play these kinds of hands unless you're the kind of person who enjoys bluffing. And remember that the more players you have at the table, the lower your chances are of actually being able to successfully pull off a bluff. So I really don't recommend that you ever try to play a hand like the ones I listed just a moment ago. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of having one high card and one low card. For example, if you're dealt an ace and a 2, you might feel that, oh, I have an ace. But the reality is you also have a 2. And even though those 2 cards together are the foundations of a low straight, they're not good. You know, and the even worse situation you could be in would be a situation where you have, like, for example, king 3. These are bad. Yes, you have a king, and you might very well match it up and have a pair of kings, but your kicker card is a 3. And you have a king, sure, you have a pair of kings, but your opponent could have also had a king and had anything better than a 3. So don't fall into the trap of having one high card and one low card and just kind of ignoring that other card because you don't think it's very important overall. Now, the last thing I really want to talk about is the idea of bad hands with fancy names. Newcomers who come to the game of Texas Hold'em are introduced to these hands fairly early on, and they always sound very fun, like deuces, or the high 5, an ace and a 5, or even Jack Daniels, Jack 7. While nicknames are fun and all, don't really fall for them. They can give you your cards the impression of being strong because they have a name, but in reality, a hand like Jack 5 or Jackson 5 is not a good hand to play, as I've explained earlier for those reasons. Don't play it just because it's called something. Play it for what it's worth. Bottom line, don't get fooled by those fancy nicknames. Now that I've gone over the best and worst hands and even taken some time to look at mid-level hands that still have a good chance of winning, I'd like to finish off by showing you some graphs that'll help you judge your starting hand better by using the power of mathematics. This picture shows the mathematical likelihood that each hand has of winning the round, assuming of course that the community cards and those of the other players aren't known. It's important for you to learn these statistics if you really want to be a great poker player. You need to be able to judge your hand as factually as possible. Remember that a lot of chance is involved in poker. It is gambling after all. But skill is a major component. You can lose with a pair of aces or you can win with a pair of twos. The point is to evaluate your chances mathematically in order to have the best possible chance of winning. So that pretty much wraps up this video. I really hope you learned something today. Let us know what you think are the best and worst starting hands, or also let us know if you have any further advice to share on how to evaluate your starting hands. Go ahead and leave that as a comment down below. And guys, while you're at it, remember to clickety-clack that like button, slam that subscribe button, ring-a-ding-ding that notification bell, and make sweet, sweet love to that share button. My name's Dominic. This has been the All-American Casino Guide reminding you, play responsibly.